Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. This video, we're going to do part 4 of Little Blue Book number 1215, and it is titled Robert G. Ingersoll, Benevolent Agnostic, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1927. And this is part 4, so we are going to be doing chapter 4. And let me find the page for chapter 4. And we will get started. There it is. Chapter 4 begins on page 40. All right, here we go. Chapter 4, The Mistakes of Moses. In my smaller way, I have, at some sacrifice, given rationalist lectures and written rationalist works for 30 years. And this is Joseph McCabe, the author. And I am therefore familiar both with the malignant revenge of the people who claim that they alone love their enemies, and the common sense advice of those who think it folly. At the very outset of my literary career, Sir Walter Besant, hardly a Christian himself, warned me not to indulge, as my friend Sir Leslie Stevenson did, in such criticism. We have to tolerate it in Stephen, he said, but we won't take it from young men like you. It moves for all that. Another famous writer, an agnostic in religious robes, still living, tried more prudently to dissuade me. These superstitions will die out. The world was growing more enlightened. This zeal for truth with a capital T was a young man's romantic dream. Ingersoll, somewhere, answers all these people in his blunt human way, without capital letters or heroics. And here's what he had to say. Somebody ought to tell the truth about the Bible. The preachers dare not, because they would be driven from their pulpits. Professors in colleges dare not, because they would lose their salaries. Politicians dare not, because they would be defeated. Editors dare not, because they would lose subscribers. Merchants dare not, because they might lose customers. Men of fashion dare not, fearing they might lose caste. Even clerks dare not, because they might be discharged. And so, I thought, I would do it myself. I say to them, keep your ideas to yourself. Feed and clothe the ones you love. I will do the talking for you. The church cannot touch, cannot crush, cannot starve, cannot stop or stay me. I will express your thoughts. I like Ingersoll. That is sound language to unbelievers generally, but the believer puts his fingers on the second word of this passage and asks, why ought? For two reasons, each of which contains quite as much common sense as, and much more sincerity than, the light phrases of the Galileos. One is that religion is still a very practical matter. Ingersoll was speaking from knowledge when, in the above passage, he counted the various classes of men, nearly all classes in the community, who dare not say what they think. A pretty situation for free America, certainly. The bulk of them are still not free. The professors only recently have shivered under the crack of the clerical whip. The politicians have signed the clerical blank check. Whose turn will it be next? The dressmakers, the tobacconists, the men who run theaters and cinemas on Sundays. Oh, a pretty situation for the year 1927. Boy, They would say the same thing for 2026. When half the population could not tell you even the names of these invisible clerical despots. How extraordinarily foolish of any man to want to talk about it. The second reason is just honest and healthy impatience of lies and delusions. Ingersoll loved liberty with a capital L. But if he at times, as is the custom, used truth with a capital T, he really meant that he hated lies. He hated to see people deceived, rather than sit by the fire with a cigar between his teeth, while a very imperfectly educated gentleman was telling utterly false things to a few hundred men and women in the next block on a Sunday night. He preferred to go and hire a hall and tell them the truth. Heroics? No, not a bit of it. Though in his case, for his life was often seriously threatened, the act approaches heroism. But in itself, on principle, it is just as natural as the act of a man who starts out on a campaign for spelling reform. Porous, underclothing, free verse, or bobbed hair. Preachers in Ingersoll's day were proclaiming the inspiration of the Bible from cover to cover. The Pentateuch was inspired to Moses. The world was created in 6 days, or acts, and Ingersoll was reading Darwin and Huxley. In other words, he went outside and poured his shot into the churches simply because he was honest Bob and couldn't help it. People want to know the truth. It is their paid officials, the clergy, who invent this fiction about disturbing people's minds. And it is all to the good. All education, especially through criticism, is healthy. In fine, Ingersoll knew from his own experience that humanism, as an inspiration, would make a better world than Christianity had done. So true. It happens that in the intervals of writing this book, I am reading an overdue novel by one of the finest historical novelists of our day, Geoffrey Farnolls, Farnolls, Geoffrey Farnolls, Amateur Gentleman. It is a particularly broad and detailed picture of life a century ago. What a mighty advance we have made through humanism. Let us try more of it, said Ingersoll. The first condition was to shatter the fetish of the traditional view of the Bible. This was the greatest hindrance to humanism, since it represented man as cursed and barren. Ingersoll was not what would be called in the academic world a scholar, but he knew the Bible thoroughly. When he was in camp at St. Louis, he used to pass the time gambling with the chaplain. He bet that if the chaplain would open the book at random and read any verse he chose, Ingersoll would give him, from memory, the preceding and the following verse. The chaplain lost money and discovered that gambling was improper. Some mistakes of Moses was the chief and most popular outcome of his critical attitude toward the Bible. It began as a lecture, first delivered in 1879, and was later expanded into a book. For its motto, Ingersoll wrote, "The destroyer of weeds, thistles, and thorns is a benefactor, whether he soweth grain or not." He always laughed at the anemic objection to mere negation. At the least, he was clearing the prairies for others to sow. But he sowed himself in every heart that read him. Inspiring passages from his writings are framed on the walls of thousands of houses in America. I wish they still were. Fathers and mothers would rather have their children read the beautiful words of Bob Ingersoll, the infidel, than the words of Jesus, to say nothing of Moses, Ezekiel, and Hosea. Well, I wish that was still true. Ingersoll begins by observing that the Bible legends are beautiful, though false, and have enriched the heart and enkindled thought. And what he wants is to broaden the intellectual horizon of our people, to do away with the blind worship of the ignoble past. I quote this only for the edification of the folk who never read Ingersoll, but pose as superior to him because they see the beauty in the Bible. Candidly, I don't. And I have read it all in Latin and English many times, very much of it in Greek, and a lot in Hebrew. I like Ingersoll better when he gets to this. The real oppressor, enslaver, and corrupter of the people is the Bible. That book is the claim that binds, the dungeon that holds the clergy. That book spreads the pall of superstition over the colleges and schools. That book puts out the eyes of science and makes honest investigation a crime. That book unmans the politician and degrades the people. That book fills the world with bigotry, hypocrisy, and fear. And it still does. Superior people came after Ingersoll and said that this was naughty and intemperate and untrue, and you might join hands with your erring Bible brother. And these good folk were quite astonished when in 1925 the fundamentalist guillotine began to chop. The above intemperate passage is as prosy a picture of Tennessee today as is the Geological Survey. I'm not sure about what that reference is, but it doesn't bode well for Tennessee of 1927, does it? Scholarship was not needed for Ingersoll's purpose. He made no pretense of quoting the Hebrew text. He seems to have known nothing about the higher critics' analysis into Jehavists and Elohists and Javist Elohists. It was unnecessary. He gets there all the same. Instead of following him, let us take for a moment what Roman Catholics, and many others on the quiet, take to be a crushing expose of the ignorance, even dishonesty of Ingersoll's book, which they have never read. I mean, Father Lambert's notes on Ingersoll. I don't know who Father Lambert is, but apparently he wrote a very scathing book on Ingersoll. The early part of it is taken up with the familiar ancient verbiage about first causes and necessary beings and infinite universes and laws of nature. The arguments for God and immortality, which, as William James said already, gather dust in our libraries, unless they are Catholic libraries, you might just as profitably chew sawdust as answer these things. Let us take the 8th chapter, in which the reverend author blushes so deeply for the blunders, the trickery, the falsehoods of the great agnostic, that you feel there must really be something in it. First, it appears that when Ingersoll represents the first commandment as the death to art in Judea, he has shamelessly garbled the text. It appears that the Bible does not forbid the Jews to carve statues, but to adore and serve them. What extraordinary things these priests can say to their guileless flocks. The commandment very plainly forbids the Jews, in Exodus 20, verse 4, to make images or to worship them. And it is a command to the laity, so that images made by Moses or the priest would not matter, even if we took those parts of the Bible as historical. And we know that they are fraudulent. What Father Lambert forgot was to name any artist or sculptor in the whole course of Hebrew civilization, which he believes to have lasted 1,000 years. Then it appears that the terrible slaughters of the Canaanites were quite all right, perfectly justified, because the Canaanites were very wicked. The Jews say so, and there you are. But the Lambertian method is seen at its best in the next passage. Ingersoll had expressed his horror at the Bible making Jehovah himself hand over the young women or defeated tribes to the mercies of the Jewish soldiers. The priests' white hands go up toward heaven. The Bible, he says, very strictly guards those maids from the philandering of the troops by enjoining that the soldiers are to marry them. Father Lambert refers us to Deuteronomy 21, verse 10 through 14. Very naive to end at verse 14. For the next verse reminds us that the soldier might have several other wives already. In fact, in verses 13 and 14, the procedure is clear enough. The girl is taken at once into the soldier's house, but he must give her a month to mourn, and then, no question of ceremony, the text adds that he can put her out of doors when he likes. Naturally, a soldier on the warpath would be rigorously pure until the appointed time with a maid amongst his spoils. A bit facetious. And the crown of the matter is that Ingersoll had expressly referred his readers not to Deuteronomy, which puts a mild sort of gloss on the brutal old practice, but to Numbers 31, where not a word is said about marriage. The passage more than justifies what Ingersoll says. It is a picture of sheer barbarianism. The troops kill all the male non-combatants and appropriate all the women and girls. Then Moses and high priest express mighty indignation. Not that they have not gone through some form of marriage with the girls, but that they have allowed the mothers to live. These anointed of the Lord then compel them to cut the throats of all the mothers, 20 to 30,000, and retain the virgins, 32,000. Marriage is not mentioned. It is a veritable orgy of barbarism, or would be, if it were not transparent fiction. Yet the Catholic, who will verify the points neither in Ingersoll nor the Bible, the correct reference to which Father Lambert has suppressed, boasts that his Father Lambert has given Ingersoll the heaviest thrashing he ever had. The book has neither ability nor honesty. Ingersoll ignored it, and I have persistently refused requests that I should answer it. The above specimen of a refutation will suffice. A more serious controversy followed an article on the Christian religion, which he published in the North American Review. Ingersoll had entitled his article, "Is All the Bible Inspired?" which was in those early days, supposed to be a very serious question. But the editor changed the title and tried to disarm his religious readers by having a reply to Ingersoll. Judge Black, who replied, had all the arrogance and not more than the capability of a third-rate apologist. His defense of every relic of barbarism in ancient Judea, under the impression that Jehovah either instituted or sanctioned the slavery, polygamy, slaughter, etc., reads very curiously today in the pages of such a magazine. Whatever reaction the future may have in store, readers of the leading magazines will never again see in them such incredible piffle from the pen of a distinguished lawyer. And for that advance, America owes more to Ingersoll than to any other man. The judge's points were easily answered. They were the familiar threadbare arguments from the laws of nature and their legislator to the philanthropic inspiration of Christianity. The great learning was needed, but Ingersoll shows that he had studied acutely each phase of the religious question. There is, for instance, still in the religious mind, the old idea of laws of nature as some code of conduct analogous to human laws, which is prescribed in advance of material bodies. On which assumption, of course, the existence of a legislator is clear as the noonday sun, and the atheist is a fool or a knave. I found in debate with fundamentalist leaders in California in 1926 that they had this idea in as naive a form as it was held by Talmage. Ingersoll gave the right answer to it half a century ago. Law does not cause the phenomenon, but the phenomenon causes the idea of law in our minds. Ingersoll temporarily, but with deadly effect, exposed the senilities of the apologist statesman, and no rejoinder to him appeared in the review. Black's friends made the amusing suggestion that Ingersoll, dreading another severe castigation, had induced the editor to refuse to readmit Black. The editor denied this, and one can easily understand that he was unwilling to have the cultural level of his magazine lowered once more by such absurdities. Some years later, in the North American Review, published an article, Colonel Ingersoll on Christianity, from the pen of one of the most distinguished of British statesmen, Mr. Gladstone, which was, in effect, one of the greatest tributes ever paid to the position and influence of Ingersoll. Gladstone took his faith even more seriously than his politics, to the fine amusement of his skeptical rival Disraeli. He was, moreover, as Morley has abundantly shown, a really fine scholar, certainly as regards Greek, and he engaged in controversy in England only with the highest representatives of rationalism, such as Huxley. But Gladstone had all the weaknesses of a semi-modernist, and was so unlucky as to consider them his strength. He referred flatteringly to the rare and inevitable brilliancy of Ingersoll, claiming only that the impetuosity of his character had carried him from ancient orthodox into agnosticism without proper consideration of the intermediate position. Dignified and leisurely persons like Mr. Gladstone, it is said that he chewed a morsel of meat systematically 14 times before he swallowed it, of course saw the wisdom of this intermediate position, this slight liberalizing of the creed, which made it suitable for even the most intellectual palate, and Mr. Gladstone proceeded, with all his customary solemnity and lack of humor, to expound the truth. Ingersoll was, as usual, temperate in his reply, but open-minded ministries must have recognized with pain the ease with which he refuted the leading churchmen of Britain. Huxley, ever twinkling and caustic, wrote to Ingersoll, "Gladstone's attack on you is one of the best things he has written. I do not think there is more than 50% more verbiage than necessary, nor any sentence with more than 2 meanings. If he goes on improving at this rate, he will be an English classic by the time he is 90. The pompous verbiage was, in fact, too much for Ingersoll, and he put Gladstone out of the arena with this remark. After all, it may be that to ride an unbroken horse with the reins thrown upon his neck, as you charge me with doing, gives a greater variety of sensations, a keener delight, and a better prospect of winning the race than to sit solemnly astride a dead one, in a deep reverential calm, with the bridle firmly in your hand." The reply was easy, for what I call the slightly liberal Gladstonian attitude is now recognized to have been only a temporary phase in the journey backwards to the real truth. Evolution might be true, but was in any case consistent with Genesis, said Gladstone. Ingersoll's nimble wit was quite enough to dispose of this ancient pastime of reconciling Genesis and science by reinterpreting a word here and there. He adds, "Many will regret that you do not give your views upon the main questions, the principal issues involved, instead of calling attention, for the most part, to the unimportant. If men were discussing the causes and results of the Franco-Prussian War, it would hardly be worthwhile for a third person to interrupt the argument for the purpose of calling attention to a misspelled word in the terms of surrender." The main points for Ingersoll, and for every man with his sheer honesty and strength and directness of mind, were three: the crudities of the Old Testament, the crudity of the fundamental Christian doctrine, and the incarnation of the atonement, and the fact that nature shows no evidence of design and very much against it. People who are now learned in mythology, geology, conchology, 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 that's a new one, I have to look that one up, or something, talk about Ingersoll's relatively scanty erudition. He needed no more. With the knowledge he had, he met every opponent effectively. Cardinal Manning of England entered the lists after Gladstone to put the Catholic position. Answering him must have felt to Ingersoll like thumping a pugilist drummy after dealing with Gladstone. As to the riffraff of the evangelical world, with their infidel deathbed stories and mendacious trash of that sort, Ingersoll had only to splutter his disdain. These controversies were forced upon him, and he dealt quite adequately with them, but his great work was the delivery of his magnificent orations to the general public. And these are a list of, I guess, his speeches. Thomas Paine, the Gods, Heretics and Heresies, Liberty of Man, Woman and Child, The Ghosts, Some Reasons Why, and The Great Infidels, etc. His main points were, as I said, simple, direct, and vital, and they lent themselves to his emotional eloquence. He rejected the Old Testament as an inspired book for the plain, unanswerable reason that it was not even a decent human book as a whole. He rejected the New Testament because it was late, anonymous, and full of contradictions, and embodied a story about an incarnation which is puerile, and about an atonement and hell which outrages our ethical and humane sentiments. He rejected the belief in immortality because it was not proved, and he rejected the belief in God because the facts of nature and life conflict most profoundly with that belief, and there is, on the other hand, no serious evidence in its favor. It is on these plain and fundamental issues that he is happiest and rendered the greatest service. It really matters very little whether Jesus ever lived, whether he is a solar myth, whether religion began in animism or Thaliasm or anything else. Ingersoll had no ambition to write learned constructive treatises for brother rationalists. The three great hindrances to the proper development of the humanist inspiration of life were the popular belief in the Bible, Christ, and God. He went straight for that belief, and he did more than any man since Voltaire and Paine to emancipate the race from superstition. People had to listen to him. He was the great orator. At one place in which he advertised a lecture, at 2 days' notice, a popular circus had been beating up public interest for weeks. The proprietor, or the circus, did little business, while Ingersoll, the proprietor of the circus, angrily said, reaped a profit of $4,000 in one night. And no theme was more suited to his eloquence or more movingly stirred the chords of his emotional nature than the cruelty in the Bible and the cruelty in nature. Ooh, pardon me. Bishop Butler had argued against the deist that the cruelty in the Old Testament did not disassociate it from God because there was equal cruelty in nature, of which the deist considered God the author. That is to say, Ingersoll retorted, he succeeded in showing that both gods are bad. He called himself agnostic only because the word atheist implies, in its ordinary usage, and as I have shown in another book, in its derivation, a denial of the existence of God. And it is important to prove it is impossible to prove a negative. While, however, one cannot in a strict sense prove a negative, there may be a vast amount of evidence in favor of the negative position, and little or none for the affirmative. Ingersoll quite recognized that this was the situation in regard to the existence of God. Agnostic does not mean simply that one does not know, or one has an open mind on the subject. When Lyman Abbott imprudently ventured upon the familiar jibe at the word agnostic, Ingersoll finally retorted. The agnostic does not simply say, I do not know. He goes another step, and he says with great emphasis that you do not know. He insists that you are trading on the ignorance of others and on the fears of others. He is not satisfied with saying that you do not know. He demonstrates that you do not know. And he drives you from the field of fact. He drives you from the realm of reason. He drives you from the light into the darkness of conjecture, into the world of dreams and shadows, and he compels you to say at last that your faith has no foundation in fact. To the small-minded parrots who repeat every year the time-worn charge that without God, Lincoln can be shown, that without God, missed a page there, that without God there can be no sense of honor or decency. Ingersoll replied with his whole life and teaching. In an early year, when he was lecturing with deadly effect in San Francisco, the clergy telegraphed to Peoria for an unfavorable reports that could be used against his character. They could get none, and none have ever been invented. He lived a transparent life, smoked a cigar, and said damn in public, and drank water and kept his kindliness in private just as he did in public. Very few men amongst the millions who shuddered at his name or listened to vilification of him by the lower types of preacher could compare with him for a moment in character. But the next chapter will give us a convenient occasion for discussing this. That is the end of chapter 4 of Little Blue Book number 1115, titled Robert G. Ingersoll, The Benevolent Agnostic, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1927. Thanks for listening, and join me in the final part, Part 5.